Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley McPhail, and I am part of the Texas Medical Center team here at the TMC Helix Park. Thank you for joining us today. This panel is part of our October Odyssey month, so exploring space, health, breast cancer awareness, and a few other items. But today we are privileged to have three wonderful people with us and experts within space and health. And so our conversation today is really going to focus on that exploration and things that we can learn both from research here in the US and how that impacts space, and then vice versa. Houston, we think through the pillars of our economy, Texas Medical Center being one of them, formed in 1945, and really a research in clinical research and now commercialization. NASA, space exploration has been part of our history. The Johnson Space Center opening in 1961. President Kennedy did his We Choose to Go to the Moon speech here at Rice University. And then since then, it has all been part of that with mission control and most other things now. That's also led the way now to commercialization. So beyond NASA, that's taking place here. And so today we are going to sort of explore those different topics, and then of course welcome questions from you all at the end. But to get us started, I'm going to ask each of the panelists just to introduce themselves and give a little bit of quick background. So Dr. Nancy.
Nancy Currie Gregg. I'm currently at Texas A&M University. I'm the director of our Texas A&M University Space Institute that's being built down on the grounds of Johnson Space Center. At A&M, I teach aerospace engineering and industrial systems engineering. My expertise is in human factors engineering. So I was an Army aviator, spent 24 years in the Army. A lot of that simultaneously. I was a NASA astronaut, flew 4 times in space, about 4,000 flight hours and about 1,000 hours in space.
Yeah, Robert Satcher. I'm currently at MD Anderson Cancer Center, where I'm in the orthopedics department. I'm a faculty member there, and the patients I take care of are people with musculoskeletal tumors, so just surgical care of cancer patients. I'm also a former NASA astronaut. I flew on STS-129 back in 2009. I only flew once. And my background also is that I'm an engineer. I have a background in biomedical engineering or chemical engineering, and we do research on just the involvement of the musculoskeletal system with cancer. I'm also a co-founder of Orbital Med, which is a company which is focused on healthcare for commercial space flyers.
Good morning. I'm Ken Wells. We have a background as a pharmacist. Actually, most of my training was right here in the Texas Medical Center. I went to pharmacy school at TSU, master's in public health at UT, and medical school here at UT. After I finished my training here, I went over and spent some time with NASA, where I met Bernard Harris and actually worked with Bobby some years later. I was flight surgeon with the Army for about 12 years, and actually I was kind of surprised because as I came in, I recognized, and then we had actually flown together when I was a flight surgeon down at NASA, not NASA, but Ellington. So it's a small world how things come full circle. I worked with NASA for about 4 years and then left there and started working in the corporate world with large corporations, as chief medical officer for several large energy-related companies, principally evolving into the issue of risk management, but incorporating much of what I learned with NASA and the world in aerospace. I was a senior AME with the FAA for 20 plus years, kind of specializing in keeping pilots, commercial pilots in the air and managing those risks that they faced and helping the corporations with the investment that they had in these pilots so that they could keep flying as long as they could. I then went back to the dark side of healthcare and got an MBA, and have really over the last 15 years been focused on quality, outcomes, the cost effectiveness of healthcare, and recently joined Bobby in his endeavor at Orbital Med as one of their executives. So delighted to be here. Have a slightly different twist on some of these things than these two astronauts who have actually been there and done that. My role was really, to a large extent, trying to make sure that we could, in some cases, clear them to do the work, but on the other hand, making sure that they were safe in the work that they were doing. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you all. I think one of my first questions is just why space? I mean, kids from an early age, you ask them what they want to be when they grow up. Astronauts is one of those things that come up. But just being a part of it is what really drew you in to that space exploration idea. And then also, obviously, from your side, Dr. Wells, of the health impact, obviously, of you think through of astronauts and what brought you to NASA.
Well, it's one of the most fond memories that I have. I grew up in Los Angeles, was actually driving out to LAX with my father in the evenings, on the weekends, and watching the airplanes come in, to land and or taking off over the ocean, and then wonder where they're going and that sort of thing. So to be candid with you, I didn't want to be a physician. That really wasn't my goal in life. I wanted to be an airline pilot. I thought the best job in the world was to be a captain on a 747, just going all around the world. Well, in my early years, I was a baseball player. I loved playing baseball, and I was a pitcher. And so I remember we were in a playoff game, and I threw a fastball, thought it was, and saw the ball hit the bat, and saw it coming toward me. It was just got the mid up, and it hit the top of it, and the ball hit me in my left eye. And I remember looking at the ground and saying, that's strange, how the ground is coming up. Well, I woke up about 15 minutes later. The ambulances were there, and basically said, well, you're okay. But the vision in my left eye went down. And I thought, well, I've no longer seen 20/20. I've seen 20/40 out of my left eye. I said, well, there goes my aviation career. And so that's when I said, well, I guess I'll look to become a physician. Now, I didn't know at the time it was 20/20 correctable. But as I went through, I said, well, I'll look for something else. But I never lost my passion for aviation. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I was attracted to become a flight surgeon and work with this population of patients. And ultimately was able to go back, learn how to fly, fixed wing aircraft, basically for everything from 172s. I got enough time in Learjet to know how to kill myself. And medical director for air ambulance companies, and spent some time with Herman as a flight surgeon over there, but never lost the passion. So the point is, you get there different ways.
My interest started when I was a kid also. Just grew up during a time when there was a lot of Hollywood focus on space, with shows that some of older people my age out there are familiar with, Star Trek, Star Wars, all this sort of thing. But I also grew up in a coastal town, and always would just sit out, look at, we were right on the ocean, and that was very inspirational for me, just thinking about exploring and explorers, the history of exploration. And just knew that I kind of wanted to be a part of that at some point in my life, although I had no idea how I would do it. I wound up becoming interested in medicine also, and just out of serendipity had the good fortune of meeting some astronauts during that time. I was out in the Bay Area, UCSF, and was involved with some research, as it turns out, that was focused on the effects of unloading on the skeleton. And for those of you who know, NASA astronauts travel out to NASA Ames out in the Bay Area to do some of their training. And I was working with an investigator who was part-time at NASA Ames, took me with her during one of the times she was going down to check on the research, and there just happened to be astronauts there, so chance meeting, and got to speak with some of them, and it just went from there. Because I always was kind of harboring this thing in the back of my mind of, I wonder, how you go about doing that. And so this was kind of my first time to actually hear from an astronaut face to face, just what the process of becoming an astronaut was and how to go about doing it. So jump ahead a few years later, I decided to go on and apply. I was at the time starting my medical career in Chicago. I was on the faculty at Northwestern there, and they had not had an orthopedic oncologist for about 10 years or so, but they needed one because they were a NCCN designated center, and which was my good fortune. And so I was getting started there, and shortly afterwards I submitted my application unbeknownst to my colleagues at Northwestern, but shortly afterwards there was the Columbia disaster, and they stopped considering bringing in astronauts for a few years, and so I kind of forgot about it. But then I'm in clinic one day, and of course get a call, hey, are you still interested? And I was selected shortly thereafter. So that's kind of the long and short of it. But just from the civilian side, because half of the astronauts at NASA are somewhere thereabouts are civilians and don't come from a military background. Most people don't know that, because probably the most common question I get asked all the time is, was I a pilot or was I in the military? So, Nancy.
My story is a little bit different. Little girls didn't grow up to be pilots and astronauts when I was a kid. My dad was a B-29 a bombardier on B-29. He was actually stationed on Tinian Island, which is where the Enola Gay launched from, when the Enola Gay launched from there. So I grew up with a love of aviation from him, and literally my first recollection is thinking that I wanted to fly. And luckily the internet didn't exist, so I couldn't Google women military pilots and get a response. There aren't any, or women astronauts, there aren't any. And when I was in high school, they started letting the first females in the military fly. When I was in college, they selected the first female astronauts. And so it was literally, the doors were just opening in front of me. But I pursued my love of aviation. Why the Army? First of all, I love flying helicopters. I've flown helicopters, airplanes, jets, and shuttles, and I love all of them. But quite frankly, the Army was most innovative, which those two words don't normally go together. And they changed from a standard 5'4" stature requirement to anthropometric measurements, which is pretty innovative. And it took probably 20 years for the Navy and the Air Force to follow suit. So that's why I was too short for everybody else. I believe, I've got locked in on the shortest astronaut ever, because they've now instituted a higher stature requirement than when I was in the program. But I think for me, it was always a call to serve this country. My whole career's been public service, in the Army, at NASA for 30 years, and now at a public university in the state of Texas.
Well, just as an aside, I'm tied for the tallest astronaut ever. So you have history on the stage
There
here.
you go.
Perfect. Well, thank you all. I think my next question is really focused on health. From managing nutrition while you're gone to the effects of gravity pull and all of these things. What are, I guess, those biggest impacts that you see to human health when somebody goes up to space? And then from y'all's focus too, of what are you doing to prevent those, and thinking through sort of those effects that they have long-term and short-term while they are traveling?
I think right now, after decades of flights, we pretty much understand the effects of microgravity. There's some things that we're still studying, spaceflight neuroocular syndrome being one, which is in large part tied to the fluid shift that occurs in the human body in a microgravity condition. So quite frankly, that one, quote, caught people off guard, but I was like 33 on my first flight, and I know I came back and reported that I was shocked that on flight day 2, I could barely read my checklist for the first time. So it took a while for that to come to light, and after some crew members experienced some permanent shift in their visual acuity, it really elevated the concern about that risk. And so I tell that story because we don't understand everything, but we have a pretty good grasp on some of the more challenging effects, and we've also got some pretty good mitigation strategies. For example, for bone demineralization, we've got exercise. However, the exercise equipment that we currently use on station is quite large and quite heavy, and is not going to work in some of our newer generation spacecraft that are traveling beyond low Earth orbit. But my concern with respect to future flights is our lack of understanding of partial gravity effects. Quite frankly, we only spent days on the surface of the moon. And so we don't fully understand the effects of 1/6G, 1/3G. Are they closer to the microgravity experience on the human body? Are they closer to 1G? If they're closer to 1G, that's a good thing. But quite frankly, we don't know that. And so it's still very much scientific exploration, including the effects on the human body. I always tell people that maybe aren't in the medical community that I truly believe our single limiting factor to missions, long duration missions beyond LEO, is the effect on the human physiology. And quite frankly, the only reason to do those missions is to explore. And so it's very much got to be a sports medicine or a space medicine with a sports medicine mindset approach to those future missions, because when those crew members land, whether it be on the surface of the moon or eventually on Mars, they have to be able to don a fairly substantial suit and perform their mission. And without that, we shouldn't have ever taken the risk to go do those missions.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. Just that there's effects of microgravity that actually act at the cellular level. One of the experiments that got a lot of attention, as it should have, was the twin experiment, of course, with Mark and Scott Kelly. They are identical twins. So Scott was in space for a year and continuously. And so they just sort of looked at what was happening at the cellular level, getting blood samples, et cetera, from them and comparing. And so, of course, they're genetically identical. They have the same genome. But what changed was the regulation of that genome. So epigenetic changes affecting something like 20% of their phenotype, which it's very interesting that that actually occurs when you go into microgravity. We don't know what the long-term consequences of that are. That's why that experiment is ongoing, to see, does this increase your risk of any kind of long-term disease or anything like that, or maybe not anything so sinister. Does it just affect how you age, and are they going to age differently? So I think some very interesting questions that stem from that. The other thought is, what about cancer risk? And since we're here right next to MD Anderson, but it's a very interesting question, because we really don't know whether or not there is an increased risk. The data set so far is pretty small. It's we haven't had a whole lot of astronauts, and so we really, I think, just haven't had enough people to understand whether or not there's an increased risk. The anticipation is that obviously in some of these deep space exploration missions, you are going to get exposed to radiation in deep space, which is, there have to be countermeasures for that, which are new countermeasures which have never been tested. So the first astronauts to go and do this will, have that risk of, whether or not these countermeasures are actually going to be as comprehensively effective as we want them to. We don't want people to, take on any more risk that way from this kind of exploration. but again, they'll be the test subjects for this. And so there's a lot of things that we don't fully understand, those kind of being at the top, when I think about it. There's many others also. I'll leave a few things for Ken, because he's one the people who, was responsible for actually keeping us safe when we traveled. So, hand it over.
Well, I think you heard two really great perspectives in terms of what the actual risks are and the like. As you may recall, I mentioned that it's the risk mitigation component of it that I had spent most of my career in, and much of this in areas outside of, aerospace. But the approach to managing it is the same. There's so much that we don't know and that we will not know the answer to until we start to progress. So as you talk about going into deep space, setting up lunar colonies, going to Mars, etc., there are challenges there that we can look at from a hypothetical perspective, but you don't know until you actually get there what's going to happen or how it will happen. And so building contingencies around that can only be built to the extent that the current knowledge allows for that. But our knowledge is accelerating very rapidly as we do this. One of the key things that when I worked with the Army and I spent some time working with some Navy and Air Force colleagues in this is, very often the limiting component of aviation and or aerospace is not the engineering of the aircraft itself, it's the people. And so you have to keep that in mind, and but what is it that makes this unique? And what is it that allows us to continue to go forward with exploration? It's the people and the value of that. So yes, you talk about there's a component on airplanes now, and you talk about fighter planes, you've heard people maybe talk about G-lock, where an airplane can pull way more G's in the air than that pilot can sustain. And so what do you do about that? Well, drones can overcome that, and it's a different discussion, but it's important to keep in mind that very often the human factor is a limiting factor, but engineering, as we move forward with this, can be the solution for much of that. So we have to look at solving these problems in cooperation with other scientists in other areas as opposed to just medicine. And so it's, again, a matter of mitigating the risk, coming up with ways to solve that. We know that the individuals will have medical risk that may ordinarily prevent someone from doing it, but you can work around those more often than not. Give you a historic perspective on some things that kind of shows how far we've come. When we first entered into the area of commercial aviation, getting on an airplane. This is kind of a rhetorical question, but the flight attendants that were on the airplanes, were you aware that initially they were all nurses? And the reason was that when they first started and moving into the commercialization space, it was, well, we're not really sure whether people will be able to, what they will do in this low atmospheric pressure environment within the cabin. Would there be some issue related to speed or altitude that we just don't know about? So they said, well, we need to have nurses on board. So the original flight attendants were nurses. Well, we learned that wasn't necessary. So that evolved, and the focus then went to safety, but it was always about safety. So the same thing is going to happen as we look forward to the evolution of this next phase of exploration and next phase of commercialization. As we commercialize space, the technology and the requirements around the support of these individuals will likely start maybe doing a little more than is necessary, but then evolve as the knowledge catches up, our knowledge catches up with what our assumptions might be.
Yeah, just some thoughts along that line. Just how do we keep people medically fit or healthy in space, in whatever that endeavor is, because that's really the question. Because as he was alluding to the airline example, but the analog in space is we're going to have people in orbit around the moon. We're going to have people, in orbit around Earth, more or less continuously. And then, if you remember Arnold's movie Total Recall, we'll have some people on colonies on Mars, right? So how do you, address these needs, which we really are only at the beginning of thinking about and developing solutions for that. I mean, I'm a surgeon, and so one of the obvious things to me is how do you take care of people surgically in these sort of extreme circumstances? If you look at just to frame it for you, if you look at the communications, delay to the moon, it's very small. It's like milliseconds. To Mars, it's like 30 minutes. So a signal, communication signal takes 30 minutes round trip to go to Mars. If you look at in terms of just getting a person back here to the home planet, from space station, it takes about 2-3 hours. From the moon, it would take about a day. Mars, it's 6 months minimum. So we have to develop capabilities for each of these circumstances. And so how do we do that? We do, I said there's not a lot out there right now because it really, we got feedback. Has not been the focus, I would say. And so this is kind of a new area of development in terms of, creating the capabilities to address medical needs under all of those circumstances. We do have a few very limited examples. Some of you may know, we have a outpost on the South Pole, and it takes, in the middle of winter, it takes like 2 weeks to evacuate somebody from there back to mainland or South America or wherever. And so they've had some circumstances, some surgical emergencies there. One of the ones that received a lot of attention was they had a guy who, and it was a favorite for me, of course, because it was an orthopedics issue. A guy who hurt his knee, so he actually had a meniscal tear. And, it just incapacitated this guy. And so they needed to do something about it. They had a medical officer there who was not a surgeon, but he needed surgical intervention. So they actually patched in a doctor from Boston, an anesthesiologist, who walked him through doing a epidural anesthetic. And then they patched in an orthopedic surgeon from Denver, and he walked him through doing a knee scope. So this was an internist, who did a knee scope on somebody. So I guess we call that just-in-time training.
Absolutely.
Everybody survived, which was the good news. I don't know how that guy's knee did long term. So it brings up all these kinds of questions. Did he get arthritis? Whatever. But at least it got him through in that particular case. And those are the kinds of things which are going to come up. Even on space station now, some of the main sort of work-related overuse injuries are orthopedic issues, but we do have some which potentially could be medical emergencies requiring some kind of intervention. We've done a few interventional things in space, like IVs, and one of our colleagues, Bernard Harris, who's actually here at TMC, was involved with this experiment doing a central line in space. And so Swan-Ganz catheter measuring, central blood pressures and this sort of thing. So we know we can do, very interventional stuff in space, and we're going to have to be able to do that. It's just The technologies are here, they just have to be adapted really for microenvironment or for, moon, Mars, the gravity that's there. And it's an interesting time because I think before we knew that this need was going to develop over time, but we're sort of in a time now where it's time to actually develop these things.
So on that note, so a lot of that is sort of thinking through the deep space, the longer missions, the impact, a little bit more of being sort of self-resilience of what you can do up there. As we're moving though into commercial flights, so right now, shorter time period, just going up for a bit, but obviously non-civilians, people that have not trained, have not gone through the NASA, what does medically fit mean for civilians going up for a short commercial flight duration, and how do you prepare for something like that?
I think you're the expert there.
Well, it's funny. It's all going to change now that it's commercialized. In some respects, when it was the government managing it, the government could mandate what the requirements are. As a flight surgeon, I had a book in the Army, which was similar to the Navy and the Air Force, but it says, here's what the requirements are, and all of this was laid out. And you kind of went down that list, and there was some discretion in terms of what you could or could not do in terms of clearing someone to fly. With commercialization, though, there's likely to be less of that. There's always this pushback, if you will, attention of, well, is it too much? What is the value of actually doing these? So the requirements that the FAA has, for example, there's three tiers. There's tier one, your recreational, actually four. There's a recreational pilot. There's a class 3, which is if you wanted to learn flying, just kind of flying on your own, you could do that. There's a class 2, which is generally your commercial pilots, and then there's a class 1 physical, which is every 6 months, which is for your commercial pilots, that are flying for Southwest, United, and those guys. All right. But the criteria for this over the years has evolved. And it's not as stringent necessarily as what the FAA, as what the military has in place for their pilots. It's similar, but it's not the same. My prediction is that there will be a pushback from the commercial folks in terms of, well, we want to do this, but it's got to make sense. So let's take, for example, the Virgin and the Blue Origin, right? So on Blue Origin, they go up, they're up for 3 minutes or so, and then they're coming right back down, okay? The physical requirements for that are nowhere near as stringent, or shouldn't be as stringent, as for someone who is going and is going to be up on let's say for 2 weeks, a month, or something along that line. So the issue of space tourism, that requirement is, I think, in my mind, is dependent upon that duration of exposure, which equates to the duration of the risk that you might identify. I think there's some value in having a screen for those individuals, but whether it's a full-on exam that we used to do on the astronauts, I don't think it needs to be anywhere necessarily near that close. On the other hand, if in that commercial space they're going to be up for 2 weeks, 2 months, a year, you'll want that information to be able to assess risk. And that's one of the areas that there's a tension, again, that's taking place right now, and a great deal of discussion around this now in terms of, number one, who would set those standards that the commercial industry will have to meet, and what will the basis be for determining what that criteria is. So it's in process. I would say stay tuned, but I do think for a number of reasons that I don't necessarily want to get fully into, they will want some requirements, because one of the things that comes when you go into the commercial space, unlike working in the government, when they signed up, and the same thing when I was in the Army, you sign up and you belong to the military, you belong to the government. In a commercial environment, you don't necessarily give up your personal rights. So if something happens in a commercial setting, and an attorney could say, well, you should have predicted this, there's a litigation piece on this, and it's a whole separate issue that one would have to give consideration to. And I want to spend a lot of time in that, but it is something that over time I think we'll start seeing.
I think there's two elements of the risk. The first one is a personal risk that space travelers are willing to accept. And I think in order to accept the risk, you have to fully understand the risk. So I'm a big proponent of fully explaining the risk. And in the case of non-professional astronauts, it's still a little bit questionable in my mind, do they fully understand the risk from a health and medical perspective as well as a safety perspective. The other part of the risk is the risk to fellow crew members or potentially even people on the ground. And I'll use egress as a case. All spacecraft are designed to fly in space, but they are also designed for rapid egress on the ground, whether that be before launch or post-landing. And that's a very important aspect. In fact, commercial aircraft that we all fly on have to meet a 90-second egress requirement. And so that dictates what individuals can fly even on a commercial airline. So I am a proponent of having certain criteria levied on even non-professional astronauts, both from the perspective of their personal safety as well as the safety of others that they're flying with or potentially people on the ground. Because if their egress is impeded, somebody's going to help them, whether it's another crew member that now delays their own egress, let's say in a post-landing fire scenario, which has happened, or whether that be to responders.
Yeah, I put it out there. It's a interesting problem because it doesn't quite fit anything that we've done before. Yeah, I think from the medical world, there's informed consent, right? You know, it's but choosing to do something like fly on a spacecraft is not the same as, you know, choosing a medical treatment, which is needed or even elective. It's not quite the same, but it does have, you know, some overlap conceptually in terms of, as was being pointed out, how much does, and the real question is how much understanding is needed. What I was thinking about is sometimes it's very difficult when people are having medical procedures to actually explain to them what the risk is and to have them have a complete understanding of what the risk is. I think with, you know, say space tourism or whatnot, it's probably a little bit easier, but there will still be some areas that aren't probably completely understood just because a lot of the aspects of it are very technical, as we know, and there's no way, you know, that to completely explain that in the course of just a short orientation to undertake something like that. The case that comes to mind, and I was thinking about too, is the whole thing with I can't remember the name of the company, but it was the deep ocean exploration recently to the Titanic that tragically ended. And their approach to that, as we've kind of subsequently learned, is basically saying, well, you know, you kind of sign your rights away or whatever if you are undertaking this exploration. So I think, you know, all of us probably feel a little uncomfortable with that being, you know, the level of, to Nancy's point, I think you should have more understanding there also, but, you know, the question being, well, what's the right level? And how do you codify that in terms of a regulation, which is what the FAA, I think, is struggling with right now. So I know, you know, that's something that we're all kind of paying attention to see where this lands.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that there are regulations for the crew, but then there's the question that, and you don't want to conflate these, as it relates to the passengers. You know, because as was brought up, the issue of egress is incredibly important, and the amount of time that you have to get off. But, you know, I've often wondered on commercial flights, if that plane is filled with passengers who are all wheelchair bound, that requirement's not going to be met, and we know that. So, there's the issue of the requirements for the passengers, which when we talk about this whole commercial and space tourism piece, that's separate and apart from talking about professional crew who operate this. And so, we want to make sure we keep those thoughts separate. But I think this demonstrates the challenge and call it growth pains, if you will, that the industry faces as it evolves to this next level. But it's I think it's exciting to talk about this.
Perfect. My next question, Dr. Currie, for you. A&M last year received $200 million from the Texas legislators to build out the Space Institute right here by NASA. But given your background in human factors design and engineering, what is sort of your vision as you're leading that into what you are sort of hoping to get out of this new institute?
So this building, which will be built on the roughly 200 acres that sits just adjacent to the Johnson Space Center, is pretty important. Proximity to the expertise is really important, and Houston has a lot of expertise in human spaceflight, and particularly down in the Clear Lake area. Essentially, we're going to have about a 400,000 square foot facility, as large as a football field, lunarscape, also a Marsscape on the other side, and then a series of, we call garages or high bay space, one of which could be a space-based hospital, to explore some of the operational concepts, to explore some of the technologies that are needed for patient care in situ in these very austere environments. So I'm excited about it because as a human factors engineer, really it's a multidisciplinary integrated team from the time of concept of an operation that's critically important. So this will involve not only industry, but academics, everywhere from engineers, health and medicine, planetary science. There's also an aspect of workforce development. In order to stay the leader in space, and that was the emphasis behind this bill, $200 million for a facility, $150 million in research and development funds over 2 years, which had called for proposals, has already been released about a month ago. The reason that the state is putting so much emphasis into space is they want to maintain their leadership, Whether it's us saying on my third flight, Houston, this is the International Space Station for the first time, or whether a much bigger event, which was landing on the moon for the first time and saying, Houston, the Eagle has landed, Houston has always taken a leadership role. There are many other states vying for that leadership role because it's no longer just NASA and Russia, but it's multiple countries and a multitude of companies, large and small, that have now entered the space market. And so there is a space economy. Semiconductor manufacturing in space, I truly believe, will be one of the next new innovations. And, as Texans, we want to enable those technologies and the concepts to have those emerging businesses. So it's opened up a whole new domain for both business, commercial space flight, as well as the more traditional roles of national governments in truly exploring space beyond low Earth orbit.
Thank you. And so, Dr. Satcher, for you, a little bit of a different question, but what, from being your study of astronaut health, going through that, how does that impact how you think about orthopedic oncology now, and what are some of those learnings that might develop from your astronaut side to how you treat patients here?
Yeah, I'll return to that question. I actually, when I was listening to Dr. Currie talk, I wanted to, because we were having a little bit of a conversation about this earlier, but the other states that are competing, we have a long tradition of, at least the human factors in space flight because of Johnson Space Center. And obviously there's going to be this proximity to Johnson Space Center, which she alluded to. But what are the other states that are competing, and how so?
Florida's got some tremendous initiatives. The state of Colorado Alabama has more specialized in military space, I would say, but nonetheless in space flight. The state of California has announced they're going to invest $20 billion over the next 20 years in space. So I think with this emergence of commercial space and the potential to do in-space manufacturing, is this new light in, hey, there's a whole new business stream here. And it is enabled by the commercialization of space.
Okay,
Yeah.
your question for me, I think it was about orthopedic oncology and the impacts of, we, a few years ago, and this is just for surgery in general, went to a checklist. And that was, in a direct adaptation of really a lot of the operational procedures that are done in space flight in particular, looking and seeing, that really helps to reduce the chaos, I would say, because the operating room is there's just a lot of things going on simultaneously. It's a complex operation. And so it helps a lot with that, and also kind of pre-briefing and post-briefing with all of the staff and everybody who's involved with carrying out a particular surgical procedure. The other thing is some of the technology. In orthopedic oncology, we do some pretty large surgeries where we're removing, like half of your femur or whatever, because of a tumor, and then reconstructing. And so some of the material science is just a direct outgrowth of some of the material science that was done for spaceships and space flight. They happen to work very well in the human body also. Some of the things that we're doing now in terms of imaging, trying to image at the level of a cell, that also, some of that technology is been used a lot in sort of spaceflight applications. And so, there's a lot of, I would say, cross-pollination between the research and also just some of the technology that's been used in space. Some of the more complex surgeries we do on complex anatomies, we do imaging in the operating room now, and we actually navigate cuts and navigate, how we're putting in screws, instrumenting, in other words. And again, that's, some of the technology which has been used, like for docking spacecraft, and it's just been adapted for us to use in the operating room. So anyway, there's a lot of applications.
Great. And then Dr. Wells, as you are now moving into a lot within the commercialization, thinking of startups, what does the space economy sort of look like today, and what are we sort of seeing from that future side?
It's an incredibly exciting time. I was reading a report, in fact, I shared it with Bobby last night, that, depending on the estimates, there's one that's that by 2040, 2035, 2040, we'd be looking at about a $1.4 trillion economy in this space. If you think about it, it's just incredible. There's another report that says, we've talked a little bit about the tourism space, that over the next 15 years is expected perhaps to have as many as 60,000 people involved with it in that space. So the numbers are actually quite huge. And from a commercialization perspective, in terms of the ability to go to test drugs in space, to test medical devices, and then to bring that technology back, as Bobby described, has just incredibly huge implications. The cost of space flight has also come down so dramatically that, again, now it's commercially viable to do these things. There's a number that I saw and I first read it. Now, put it in perspective, the cost of a flight to take something up and bring it back has been reduced by 95%. Just if you think about it, that's just incredible given the capabilities of commercialization. If you saw the issue with SpaceX and their ability to send the rocket up and bring it back and land, and the whole chopsticks piece, all of that. The technology alone, just watching it, is absolutely incredible. So as I said, it's a very exciting time to be involved in this. In some respects, as I was watching it, I was thinking, well, we're probably in a situation similar to where Columbus and that group, when they decided that the king during that time was willing to invest to allow for the exploration of the rest of the world. They didn't really know what they were going to find, but they were willing to do that. I see us in that similar sort of place. And so as I think about the commercialization aspects and the potential opportunity that I've had the privilege of working with Bobby and others on, so what is the healthcare aspect here? And there will always be that need to provide care to these folks who are on that leading edge. What will that look like? What's the technology that's going to come out of that? And where's the value for this? It's just a very exciting time and a very exciting place for us to be. And I think that investors see this now, and they see it as a longer term play, but they also see that there's huge potential here. Billions of dollars are now coming into this space from investors around the world.
Perfect. So I guess my final question, and then we'll see if we have time to open it up to the floor. Pretty much 55 years ago, man first walked on the moon. What does what does 55 years from now look like when you think of space exploration? Whether that's where we're exploring, or the innovations that we've seen. What is sort of y'all's vision of what is coming?
One of the reasons why we decided in our facility to include a Marsscape is because if we don't build it and we're not prepared, then that time will never come. I was selected as an astronaut in 1990. We were told we were going back to the moon and on to Mars by President Bush in 1989. So our class patch has the moon and Mars, and we thought we were the ones. And political climates change. The willingness to invest in space changes over time, and the mission changes. And we've learned a tremendous amount of data that we've gathered on the International Space Station. But it's time to push beyond low Earth orbit. So first and foremost, I truly believe that finally in the next couple of decades, we will finally achieve our goal of pushing beyond even the moon and exploring deep space.
Yeah, I agree with Nancy, and I think it's instructive, though, just with the times we're living in, to look at the competing forces. And I mean, we're the biggest threat to ourselves, of course. Yeah. So it really depends on how we navigate things with ourselves, just politically and otherwise. On the technological side, it's a very promising time. The transistors or chips are getting faster and faster and faster, and so they're nowhere approaching what the human brain does. But they're getting ready to come out with this 18A chip, where the transistor is actually, the 18A is 18 angstroms in size, which is think about 15 atoms in length. And so, Moore's law is still in effect and still packing it, tighter and tighter and tighter, which means faster and faster. So that's very promising. That's what we need, to have AI on orbit and AI functionalized and making it a reality like that. So it just depends on which forces win out.
I go back to when I was a kid. One of my favorite things was to read Popular Mechanics. And to be candid with you, I thought that we would have been a little further ahead than we are now. But as I kind of stop and think about it, sometimes technology has to catch up with our imagination. So as a 8-year-old, the whole reading comic books, Dick Tracy and his watch. Well, I can now talk to my watch and answer my phone through my watch. So it has become a reality. I think the technology, perhaps, it doesn't necessarily accelerate as quickly as our imagination. That said, though, we are now poised, I think, that the only thing limiting us is our imagination, and that the technology will keep abreast. The only question is, do we have the commitment to do it? Do we create the environment where it makes sense to do this? And I think that as we move toward a more commercial model, and where it becomes clear that the investment makes sense and that there's value in it, I think that we'll see a greater move to that. And we're only limited by our imagination in terms of how far we'll go and how much we'll do. But I just think it's part of the human nature, almost, of wanting to know what's there, of the desire to learn. You know, and in some respects, it's almost like, I don't want to say any kind of, we're in a science, but it's almost a spiritual sort of a thing too, of, you know, what is out there? What's on the other side? We once thought the world was flat. We know that's not the case. But if we had the ability to travel light years and the things that we said, and that technology gets to that point, what will be out there? And I think that that's what drives us as humans. And we won't likely get there in my lifetime, but for my kids and for others, I just think it's a very exciting time. And as I look at the young folks here, I can say that I can remember sitting at the tables where you are, that I'm jealous, quite frankly, that of the things that you're going to be able, that you will see and will be able to do, and the space that you'll be able to work in.
Perfect. Well, with that, I think we do have time for a question or two. If somebody, right behind, yeah, we'll start there and then go.
I guess I just wanted to start by saying there's such a wealth of experience and knowledge, and just a deep thanks to you three for sharing that and your careers and what you've learned over the years with us. So I'm on the faculty with the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy, and we have funding from the Translational Research Institute for Space Health to map some of the ethical obligations of different research stakeholders to the public, to society. And I would love to hear some of your philosophical reflections on what are those obligations. In particular, we argued in a science paper earlier last year that there is a social responsibility for people to participate in research, to expand the evidence base for many of the reasons that you outlined, for safety, for diversity in data sets, and in particular, data sharing as well. So as we move into a commercial sector, the incentives to share data are not necessarily always aligned with those that were in the government and defense sectors. So I would love to hear some of your reflections on those themes, if you could.
I always viewed part of my job description as being human guinea pig as an astronaut. I believe that we had, like you said, it's almost an ethical responsibility to participate in some of the medical experimentation. Unfortunately, along the way, that wasn't shared by all. On my first flight, our commander actually removed several of us from some of the medical tests because he felt that we were putting ourselves at risk, that we could get injured perhaps in doing some of these post-flight medical tests and jeopardizing our future flight careers. But I really believe that's up to the individual. And I do think there is an ethical responsibility. There are so few people, relatively speaking, that are enabled to have this experience, that part of going through that experience should be the participation in gathering of the medical effects on the human body. Because as I said, despite the fact of decades of experience, we are still learning. So I am in firm agreement that there is an ethical obligation on the behalf of people who willingly participate in spacefaring missions.
Yeah, I agree. But concurrent with that, there's also the ethical requirement in my mind to make sure that, number one, informed consent. To the degree that I can say, here's the risk that we know, or here's the unknown we have relative to that. Do you still agree to accept this risk as a subject in this study? realizing that there's much that we don't know. And then to the extent that there are things that we know that we can do to mitigate that risk, I think that we're ethically obligated to take that into the consideration. Well, that's a very good question. To the extent that the resources, rational resources, are there to do it, I think you should. But when we talk about the mitigation of risk, and this is something I've worked with my entire career, if you try to mitigate every risk that exists, it no longer becomes commercially viable to do something. Because quite frankly, if you were to say to me, I want you to mitigate the risk for everyone on this dais to not fall off, the only way I could do that is to say, okay, you can't leave the dais, right? If you want 100% safety and reliability for that request. But there are risks around it that we know that we can substantially reduce it by putting handrails and the other sort of things that go with it. And to the degree that you can measure those and you know what the costs are, then you can do those. But if the goal is to say our goal is to reduce any and all risk, then nothing will ever occur. Risk is implicit to everything we do from the time we get up in the morning to the time we go to bed at night. It's just there. It's how we manage it that determines it. Now, the ethical issues around it, that's another question, and I'd love to have a more in-depth discussion with you about that.
Yeah, I think it's just interesting thinking about the relationship between government and in the private sector in that regard, because typically it's been the government that's played an essential role that way in terms of in interpreting and thinking about what the ethics of it should be and in establishing the policies. And NASA has played that role. It's been the leader in space, and now I think everybody expects it to be the leader in the space industry also in terms of setting those standards. Just as an example, its commitment for the Mars mission is to get everybody there and back safely. It sounds very simple, but that when you start thinking about all the layers there and what that means, I think that's a very important standard to set, and it just sets the tone and the culture that is incorporated by diffusion, if no other reason, into the private sector.
Perfect. And I think we have time for one more question.
First of all, I want to thank you. I didn't know if I really wanted to come to this, but this has been very exciting. And I have to say, looking at you and looking at the years that you were in school, we're probably in the same genre. So I was a environmental science and chemistry teacher before I went into healthcare as well. But with that said, Dr. Currie, thank you for being a many but mighty leader, if you will, for helping kind of, to your point, talk or address some of the diversity issues that need to be happening in science. And for you, I agree wholeheartedly, Dr. Wells, about the importance of imagination and technology, because you're right, Dick Tracy, I'm in that genre as well. But my question or my comment, and I'd like for you to speak to, how do you feel that when we speak to the ethical issues in space and technology, why Mars in particular? Because it's a hostile type planet that I think in terms of what I've read and what I understand. And what is our responsibility ethically as we've kind of taken natural resources here on Earth and be responsible space travelers, medical professionals, and ethical professionals? How do you feel about any of those things?
There's a lot to unpack in that question. Yeah. Yeah. So, the question of why Mars? And, and I guess my response is, and I don't want it to sound flippant, okay? But my response is, why not, right? Why, there were people who said, why go to the moon? Well, because we want to learn. Why go to Mars? There are things that we could learn there. It's a hostile environment, but maybe there's life there that we just don't understand. Why go to any of the other planets? But I think it's innate to man's nature to learn and to discover. We discover everything around us, but we also, that same thing turns inward. So as we start looking at our bodies and how our bodies work, and I know it's kind of a weird analogy, but it's similar in the respect that there's an innate desire to want to learn what's out there and what's inside. And so I see that as a big part of why we do this. Because we don't know what we don't know. We might assume some things that, I was looking, they were talking about, I think it was Jupiter and, the ice and whether if they drove through there, that they would find that there's life that lives below this ice cap and that sort of thing like that. Well, that's intriguing to me. And we think about life and life forms, but they may not be life forms as we know it here. And so the ability to allow your imagination to capture that and how to, how do we interpret?
Maybe we have to be, as humans, possibly be in spacesuits, that sort of thing. Are there any more planets that have space?
Well, and I'm going to let the astronauts speak to the suits, but what I do know about the suits, the technology related to the suits has evolved dramatically. And the suits now are not the suits that were then, they're less bulky, and I think that technology is going to continue to advance to the point of where it may manage a lot of those issues that we have in terms of, deconditioning and other aspects that occur in this environment. So, I think that there's the issue of our current technology juxtaposed against what our future technology will be, whether it's suits or it's the vehicles to get us to these places, all of that. And I think that we have to think not only with current technology, but future technology is what's going to get us there. So,
as a member of the Texas Space Commission, which was just stood up this year, I'm very mindful of the fact that the investment that the state has made in space also has a perspective of it's not about just enabling the health and safety of a few people that get to leave the planet. It is what we can do for all Texans through these missions and the technologies and the concepts that are developed. Because, the story that Bobby was relating in terms of the Antarctic mission and medical care. Care for a crew member on another planet or, orbiting the Earth for a long duration, and the support needed, the technologies needed, can also be applied to Texans living in a very rural area that don't have access to medical care. And even beyond Texas, obviously, in other remote areas of the world. So I think that's something that NASA used to do a good job at. They used to talk a lot about the spin-off technology and the benefit to greater mankind of the technologies and the knowledge that was gained through these exploration missions. And I think it's going to be a very purposeful mindset in the future to think about that, because we do feel chartered to have that mission to develop technologies and develop equipment and gain knowledge that can better the life of everyone, but not just from an economic standpoint, but a health and medicine standpoint as well.
Yeah, I think we have to go to Mars, and there's practical reasons for it. I think it's a survival issue, honestly. Just knowing how we are as people. We're exhausting this planet. This planet can only take so many of us, and we can only take so many of us on this planet. So it's, we got to go. We got to find other places to go And the side benefit is, it's going to drive exploration and discovery and everything else. It'll make us better in many ways. So we have to go.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for attending today, and thank you very much for our panelists for joining us. It's unbelievable to think of just the level of experts and knowledge that we have here connected to TMC and NASA, and that we get to take advantage of it. I did want to call out 2 upcoming events as well. Next Wednesday, we have the leader of the Houston Food Bank, who will be here talking about all the work that they do, obviously to support the Houston community. And so as we go into the holiday season, sort of nice to sort of think about that as well. And then the following week, on October 28th at 9 a.m., we are actually having a panel of space startups. And so continuing this conversation of commercialization, the space economy, and hearing for those within our community that are working on this other piece. But thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you soon.